Okay, we'll go ahead and start. Hello, everybody. We're going to get started. My name is Sarah Beckham. I'm the Associate Director of the Center for South Asia. And before we kick off today's talk, I'd like to make just a few short announcements. Next Thursday at the same time, 12 p.m. Central, we will have a talk by Smita Narula, the Hobb Distinguished Professor of International Law at Pace University, on rural resistance and renewal in India. And that talk will also be accessible via Zoom. So Shatranjay, if you could add the Zoom link in the chat for anybody who's interested, that would be great. And then for those UW-Madison students, we have extended the deadline for the International Studies Teaching Fellows Program application. That deadline will be Friday, November 12th. So please feel free to reach out to anybody who's interested. We're thrilled that you could all join us for today's talk. The format for today's event is going to be approximately 45 minutes of presentation by our guest lecturer, followed by 15 minutes of a moderated Q&A. You can drop your questions both into the chat or into the Q&A either during or after the presentation. And we ask that all participants help us to create a safe virtual space for learning and exchange and engage respectfully and professionally with the speaker and other participants in the chat. The Center for South Asia reserves the right to remove any disruptive participants from today's event. I'm now going to hand over the introductions to Professor Darshana Mini.
Thank you, Sarah. It's my pleasure today to welcome Dr. J. Devika. And J. Devika is a feminist historian, social science researcher, and translator based in Kerala. She's a professor at the Center for Development Studies and writes about the intertwined histories of gender, politics, development, and culture in modern Kerala. And her literature and scholarship has been so important in laying the foundation of the feminist interventions in Kerala. And for many of us who work in on the social history of Kerala, her work has been really, really important and so inspiring to actually think through ideas. Her other areas of interest include history of migration and cosmopolitanism. And she has also written multiple books in English and Malayalam, and she's a translator. One of the things I really want to foreground here is the website that she is curating. And this is a wonderful resource for anyone who cannot read Malayalam, but is curious to know more about feminist writings. So this website is actually trying to pay homage to the first generation of feminists and include various English translation of their writings and speeches. The title for Dr. Devika's talk today is Frenemies with Feminism, Hindutva, Women in Kerala, in which she brings to focus how women's participation in Kerala's right-wing politics is shaping this new kind of intervention in the current political scenario. Over to you, Dr. Devika, and glad to have you here.
Thank you so much, Darshana, Sarah, Shatrunjay, all of you. Thank you, all of you who have come to listen. Thank you for that really generous introduction to Darshana. I think, I am someone who works in a corner of the world, actually literally in a corner of India called Kerala, which is a state in the southwestern corner of the Indian subcontinent. Well, most of my work really is relevant primarily to this region, but some of it goes beyond, is of relevance beyond. And I think today's talk is one such. So we have, at the outset, I know that you know this, but let me just reiterate. I'm talking here today about Hindutva women, not Hindu women. Hindutva is, there is very often there is a confusion about these two terms, but in Hindu is of course refers to a religion, a broader religion, a religion that has been around for centuries. Hindutva is a relatively more recent phenomenon. It refers to a form of very militant, aggressive cultural nationalism, which claims that the Indian subcontinent ought to be controlled exclusively by members of religions that are native to the subcontinent, primarily, of course, led by the Hindu elite, the upper caste elite. So Hindutva is, of course, in power in India. the ruling dispensation subscribes to this ideology. And in many ways, there's of course very interesting discussions on Hindutva all around, especially about the sharings of Hindutva with fascism, and there's a lot of interesting theoretical discussion on these sharings. Now, let me just share my screen. Is it visible?
Yes.
Yes, it's visible.
Okay, lovely. So just a second. Okay, yeah. Yeah. So I understand Hindutva in the way Paola Bashita defines it. Paola Bashita is the scholar who has produced very, very important work on Hindutva, gender and Hindutva, particularly on mobilized right-wing Hindu women, Hindutva women. So she defines it as, and I quote her here, an extremist religious nationalism of elites, in which elites make strategic political use of elements drawn from one religion to construct an exclusive, homogenized, other repressive cultural nationalist ideology and practice to retain an increased elite power. So as I just mentioned, this is the ideology of a group of organizations ranging from the so-called cultural organization, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, known as the RSS generally. Again, you see, just a century old, and the ruling political party, the Bharatiya Janata Party, right up to all kinds of regional groups, quite violent ones actually, which police women's sexuality, sartorial, set sartorial codes for the ideal Hindu woman, try to enforce these codes through violence. So it's a whole range. And they are usually, this whole range is referred to as the Sangh Parivar. Now, there is a relatively abundant literature on Hindutva women in other parts of India. As I told you, Kerala is a South Indian state, and it's a southwestern part of India, and it is not really a, Hindutva has relatively been less successful, is what we think for the state. Anyway, there's a copious literature on Hindutva women in other parts of India, and which has all these different, basically the focus is on agency, on Hindutva women's agency and the complexity and flexibility of their agency. This literature also tracks gendered agential spaces in Hindutva, because these are always in flux. Some of them open, and offer some possibilities for women, and these possibilities may or may not be realized, mostly not realized, and then they close under other set of conjunctures. And Hindutva subjectivities, particularly gendered Hindutva subjectivities, is also an important concern in this literature. Then there's a lot of very interesting literature on gender and violence, Hindutva violence. And these scholars have actually tried to theorize the difference between the so-called peace. In fact, they have questioned this whole idea of everyday peace and the riot, and they try to identify a continuum of violence that ranges from the tense peace of the everyday and the open violence of the riot, and the implications of this for women, especially younger women. There's also very interesting work that reflects on the ambivalence of these discourses. So in some ways, in fact, the discussion I'm trying to initiate here right now probably belongs to that stream. So the ambivalence of Hindutva women's discourses that simultaneously blames women, feminists, but then also shares many of these feminist goals. So how this ambivalence is managed is an important concern in this literature, and I probably will contribute to that. Now, in this literature, however, Kerala is poorly represented, and there are very few studies of PT and religiosity, and even fewer of right-wing women. PT and religiosity, yes, there are some interesting studies, but the point is, that this is not just a neglect. This is not just some ordinary kind of neglect. And also not because women here have always been on the left. Now, Kerala is associated with communist politics. Kerala was the state which elected a communist government to power in the 1950s, the first government of independent of Kerala as a state, as a linguistic state formed within independent India. The first government was a communist government, and it is known to be, the association in the literature between communism and Kerala has been quite strong. In fact, the early work by political scientists, for example, in the 1950s and 60s, has all been on communism. Then, of course, in the 1970s, Kerala came back into attention for what is called the Kerala model discourse. This had to do with a certain, strange, at least to some scholars, anomalous finding about the development of Kerala in the economic development in Kerala in the 20th century, the historical experience of development. Here you had a state where economic development was very, very poor, but social development indicators were comparable to Europe. So in terms of education, health, women's literacy, contraception, falling birth rates, falling infant mortality rates, maternal mortality rates, etc., etc. This extremely poor state could compare with the OECD countries. Now, this observation spawned a whole discourse, which is called the Kerala model discourse. Now, and that is how Kerala came back into the international social science attention in the 1970s. And in this discourse, women were an important presence, but women were always viewed as rational agents of modern domesticity. So in some ways, women's right-wing propensities, which were actually there, it's not as if they were not there. This was a blind spot, even in the feminist critique of the Kerala model framing. The feminist literature on social science and historical literature of the 1990s and after were deeply critical of the Kerala model discourse because women were reduced in this discourse as agents of modern domesticity and nothing more than that. However, they too, the feminists, here I'm being self-critical because my writing also belongs to this period. You did not see much effort to look at the right-wing propensities of women. Now, this lack came to us like a slap on the face very recently. So this is called the name Shabarimala, which you can see on the slide. It refers to a temple in Kerala. It's a forest shrine in Kerala, a very famous center of pilgrimage. Essentially a male pilgrimage, because there was a myth, it's a very prominent myth about the deity of the temple called Ayyappan being a young celibate warrior who prohibited women of menstruating ages from entering his shrine. So this is a myth, or rather a myth that is amply supported by the Brahmin, the elite priestly class, which is in charge of this shrine right now. So it's essentially a male pilgrimage limited to some months of the year because it is in the forest. It's a forest shrine deep in Kerala's rainforest. And pilgrims trek through the forest a distance to reach this shrine. So the official claim is that there are some 40 to 50 million pilgrims, male pilgrims, who arrive at this destination during these months from all over Kerala. And of course, as you can guess, it's an important cash cow for the Kerala government. I mean, the Kerala government manages temples through what is called the Devaswam board, a board, basically a government constituted board, which manages all the major temples in Kerala. The Devaswam board, for the Devaswam board, it's a major source of income. Also, the temple authorities, who are mainly the priestly class, the Brahmin priestly class, as well as a certain royal family, a Kshatriya royal family, which is associated with this myth of Ayyappan. Now, this is the temple for you. I mean, it is, you can see the background is the Western Ghats. I will not go into detail about the confrontation. Now, what happened was on 28th September 2018, the Supreme Court of India struck down the prohibition of women of menstruating ages from the forest shrine. Now, this litigation had been going on for a few years. It was actually initiated by the women members of the Rashtriya Swayam Sevak Sangh, the women's wing of the some women lawyers in the Rashtriya Swayam Sevak Sangh. So the Rashtriya Swayam Sevak Sangh has been for a long time arguing that temples in India, of course, they have no imagination of the temple being an equal space and so on, but they have this imagination of the temple being the rallying point, the space of mobilizing all sections of the Hindu population. And therefore, they had generally argued that women of menstruating ages should also be allowed to visit the shrine as pilgrims. Now, the Supreme Court judgment, after a long time, that is, after the litigation stayed in the court from 2016 onwards, it has been going on. In 2018, it was struck down. That was a context in which there was a huge, massive public protest led by right-wing forces, the joint front of temple authorities interested in protecting the Shabarimala's peculiar myth and customs, and the broader constituents of the Sangh Parivar. So now, this is to just give you an impression of how male this pilgrimage is, and how extremely packed, what kind of, how big the pilgrimage is. So you can see only male bodies, the policemen, the pilgrims, everyone is male, and the place is like packed always. Look at this. I'm sure, I'm sure many of us are thinking of safety hazards of this kind of crowd, how the crowd of this kind is controlled, but those are not concerns in India for most of the time. And yeah, definitely not in this pilgrimage. So the reactions were very intense. Initially, it was welcomed by the RSS and the BJP, but they very soon changed, seeing the local outreach. A very strong vested interest, as I mentioned to you. There's massive protests broke out against the ruling Communist Party of India Marxist-led government. So Kerala is right now, it was ruled at that time by a left-led government, which vowed to implement the Supreme Court verdict. And it's still ruled by the same government. Anyway, so there was this huge, huge mobilization in public. There was a lot of violence against women who tried to attempted the pilgrimage, now that the Supreme Court of India had permitted them to do so. While the government professed its commitment to the Supreme Court judgment, its actual responses were far more ambiguous. The blame was put on the feminists. The blame of, so the several women attempted to do the pilgrimage, to go on the pilgrimage, and the government itself blamed them. And of course, it was all about feminists trying to create trouble. There was a large turnout. And what was really striking about this was there was a large turnout of women in the protests. So these are some of the images. So you've already seen this image, I think. Yeah. So there you are. You have young women, old women, all kinds of women. See, yeah. This was a protest, I believe. This whole slogan, "Ready to Wait." That's what we will discuss today. I want to talk about the "Ready to Wait" hashtag campaign a bit more. Yeah. Groups of women went on a social media campaign saying that they were ready to wait. And ready to wait for what? Ready to wait for menopause, because the rule in the temple is that women can be permitted there only after menopause. Young girls who have not reached their menarche can go, and after that, only women who have crossed menopause can go. Yeah. So these are the images of some of the leaders of the campaign, which I want to talk about. All right. So Now, the ready-to-wait campaign. Now, this was led by, much before the Supreme Court judgment was issued in 2018, one of the Hindutva platforms created by a group of highly qualified, educated, elite Malayali women in as early as 2016 had begun a campaign saying that they did not want the customs of the temple to be upset and that there was nothing inherently misogynist about this prohibition. So this was a very high decibel campaign on social media to preserve the customary exclusion of women from the pilgrimage to Shabarimala. And it became very powerful after the verdict and brought a very large number of educated upper middle class women, upper and middle class women, who were not hitherto directly exposed to the Hindutva politics and ideology. And the Ready to Wait was, as I said, was mainly a social media campaign, and it mobilized women on social media mainly, but its leaders were very active, visible in the social media and in the offline public protests as well. Some of them were actually directly members of the BJP. Some of them were actually, leaders of the NRI groups of the Bharatiya Janata Party, which is the Hindutva right-wing party. So, so this campaign was such a great success. It was a great success. It created shockwaves among the admirers of progressive Kerala. So it was a shock because, as I told you, women in Kerala were largely discussed in connection with the leftist efforts to advance social development. To see so many young educated women come out into the public and say that we want the exclusionary practices to come, we don't mind it. We are willing to wait till menopause. We don't mind being excluded from the temple. It was obviously very shocking. So they did not have the answers to questions about how these women, who are beneficiaries of the legacy of social development here, could turn against it so starkly. Now, in this paper, I'm trying to answer some of these questions. I'm trying to reflect on how specific regional interests, in this case, the upper caste, Malayali means native of Kerala, speaker of Malayalam literally, and refers to people from Kerala. So the upper caste Malayali elite can ride or use Hindu nationalism to extend their own power, and how they may exist in tension with the Hindutva majoritarian national mainstream, even as they further the national agenda of Hindutva over here. So in this paper, I'm going to offer some insights about the history of social change in 20th century Kerala that made such a mobilization of upper caste Hindu women possible. And this is very important when we consider the fact that while the subjectivity of these elite women, who I will call the neo-Savarna women, I will explain that later, lends itself easily to the call of majoritarian Hindu politics, and its shaping within the matrix of regional caste power has left a very strong imprint. So it's more complicated than just a few women getting into the Hindutva bandwagon. It's a little more complicated than that. And that is where I think we have some room to reflect about the agency of Hindutva women in this particular struggle. Yeah, and Savarna just refers to upper caste, basically upper caste people. Neo-Savarna refers to the new elite of Kerala, who were empowered by social change in the 20th century and took on the various features of upper caste existence. And so they're called, which means that besides the traditional elite, this also includes many members who are from traditionally the lower caste, who were traditionally lower caste, who have gained the upward mobility and are now seeking to enter the ranks of the Savarna. And this work is based on so this was a social media campaign. So my material for this work is mostly social media posts by the ready-to-wait women, and something like 70, more than 70 actually, but I cite nearly 70 social media posts. And yeah, here this is very interesting because Lauren Berland's idea of the intimate public. This is a digital intimate public. And I'm drawing here obviously on Lauren Berland's idea. And it's very rich in personal detail. And it's very, this body of writing is particularly interesting because, it's a space in which women who are strangers form a community through shared affective ties. They're not always political, but in times of crisis, they may change and actually become political, as we actually saw in the course of this agitation. And as again Berland points out, this public deploys sentimental models, and I'm quoting her here, sentimental models of effective recognition to establish political grounds for imagining survival according to their own interests. So it's very much very rich actually, because the best thing is that because it is an intimate public, women do speak in an unguarded way, and I think this is therefore it's a resource much richer than interviewing, for example. So to begin with, before I speak of the ready-to-wait women and their agency, as I said, let me just briefly sketch the 20th century history of right-wing assertions by women in Kerala. So in the late 19th and 20th century, were thought of in Kerala's history, especially in mainstream liberal and left historiography, as essentially liberatory for all women. But feminist historiography has challenged this. They have pointed out that even as women in this period were increasingly encouraged to enter education and granted formal rights as citizens, this was also a period when binary gender and foundationalism, a kind of not biological foundationalism, which entrenched binary gender became common, became well established in Malayali society, and women were assigned to the housewifely and community roles that involve nurture and care. So that's clear. That's a now very well established in the literature. However, this history has not emphasized sufficiently the extent to which the reform of the powerful Savarna community called Nayars. They are lower down in the Savarna hierarchy. Nevertheless, they're very powerful. They're a powerful group in Kerala called the Nayar. Now, the reform of the Nayar women projected them as deserving equal status in performing rituals, especially at home. So in some ways, the idea of the ritual was transformed in the 20th century as something that women could partake in as long as it was not in a temple at home. So this was very, very important. This was a very important part of imagining the new domestic woman. So in the social development literature looked only at women's role in furthering education of children, improving their healthcare, etc., etc. The social development literature, of course, ignored this part, that the new rituals, the new Hindu rituals, were also viewed at home particularly. Were viewed as the woman's domain, as part of the woman's, the ideal domestic female. And in fact, early reformers, and when I look back on my own work, I can see how much I have myself omitted to see. So early women reformers of elite women were indeed active in the reformist process of selection, by which the true Hindu faith was to be retrieved from decadence. So the women were also active in saying that, okay, this ritual is good, we should retain it. Some other rituals which are bad, let's throw it off. And they were very clear that they did not want to be like Western women. They did not want mobility. They did not want to go and walk in parks. They did not want to dance with men. They just wanted to be good Hindu women who sit at home and take care of their children and perform their domestic rituals. So this is one part of our history which we really didn't bother to take note of until this calamity actually. This calamity broke upon us in the late in this century. So in almost all modern communities of the 20th century, women were projected as guardians and protectors of faith and virtue at home. And in the course of the 20th century, upwardly mobile non-elite communities tended to adapt these norms. So associating women with domestic rituals is very common now, and there's plenty of historical work, and also now there is anthropological work in Kerala, which, for example, the work of the scholar Sharika Tirunagama from Stanford, which looks closely at women who are not really upper caste, they're lower caste, but they still, place a great stake on performing rituals and distancing themselves from even more lower caste people. So now towards the end of the 20th century, there were several factors that actually accelerated this. So for example, guru worship became very common in Kerala from the 1980s onwards. There were figures like Chinmayananda who drew a huge following, but nothing to compare with a relatively recent phenomenon of Mata Amritanandamayi, who's a god woman, who has a very large, shishya, disciples, and of course she the Hindutva ideals of home and home and hearth and marriage, etc. They actually circulate through the guru worship networks already, even before the 2018 protests. Then, of course, there's something which I can talk about it in the Q&A if you want to, but this I call spiritual capitalism of the late 20th century, where temples themselves began to have brands, began to offer certain brands, and the Ayyappa temple of Shabarimala is a certain brand. And the owners of the ones who control the temple, the priestly elite which controls the temple, wants no changes in the brand, which is actually yielding them very good profit anyway. And of course, there are the new communication technologies and the internet, which allows people. Now, Kerala is also marked for its large migrant population, very large number of people from Kerala who are settled elsewhere. A lot of Hindus from Kerala are settled in Europe and the US and Australia and so on, in the first world, that is, who connect through this network and share Hindutva ideologies. And cultural nationalism is extremely popular among the NRI, the non-resident Indian, non-resident NRK, non-resident Keralite population. So therefore, yeah, this image is of the protest in London, save Shabarimala, respect our Hindu traditions. You can see this is not about women. So you see that first line in the poster right behind this group. It says, this is not about women or discrimination. They have to say that because they are not in India. They are in in a place where this looks obvious, and more people are likely to notice it than elsewhere. This is from London. This is from Chicago, and this is from London and many other places. There are plenty of photos online. And even, in fact, now let me just get into what is unique about the ready-to-wear. There's several things. Now, as I said, it was no, ordinary, jumping into some Hindutva bandwagon. It was very interesting. These women in the ready-to-wear campaign had a very interesting spin on the whole story. First of all, there is a way in which they see ritual as a neutral practice. So they say that rituals have nothing to do with discrimination. You have different rituals for different castes and different genders. So don't compare. It's all about difference. So because it's difference, these are non-commensurable. So why are we even trying to compare all this? And therefore equally benign to all. So, you cannot have any kind of a general evaluation, because the ritual, the Hindu temples have rituals which are far beyond anything that reason can really identify. So even children are supposed to be demanding it. So see this picture of the young girl who says that I've come here third visit. I will come here only after 41 years when I turn menopause. I turn the age of menopause. So even children, and this was thought to be okay. Some of Kerala's child rights bodies did protest against the use of children in this way, but the protesters kept on using children in this way. And further, the ritual is supposed to link the deity and worshipper in a certain web of vulnerability. So it's not a one-way. So, normally the common sense understanding of worshipping in a temple is that you have a powerful God and a powerless devotee, and the devotee seeks to place their burden in front of God. But that's not how this group understands. It sees the deity as equally vulnerable. So, such that the proper observance of ritual is necessary for the well-being of both. And so ritual practice is demanded as a right, saying that this is Ayyappan's right. And Ayyappan himself is treated like a mortal. So just look at these quotes. So, this is from the Facebook writing of the supporters of the Ready to Wait movement. They had a series called the Ready to Wait story. So asking supporters, post a video or write a story on your Ready to Wait story. So this is like, now Ayyappan looks like, in this first quote, Ayyappan looks like he were some young guy, maybe a college student, or your roommate, maybe a roommate in college. That's what he looks like. And Amrita Anandamayi kind of says that he's as helpless as a fish in an aquarium, and it needs to be protected. But then, this is one thing, but another group of supporters are all for seeing this as something to do with science. So, something to do with science. That is to say that, look, there is a science in this whole thing, which modern science cannot understand. So there is this theory advanced of divine energies that may be polluted by the presence of that actually may be diminished by the presence of a menstruating woman. I mean, woman of menstruating age. Let's not forget that it's not the menstruating woman who's being excluded. It is all women of menstruating age, irrespective of whether they are actually menstruating then or not. So the presence of a woman capable of menstruation itself can pollute these divine energies and diminish these divine energies. This is one argument. Then another group of women who claim to be menstrual educators and so on, and claiming that their understanding of female menstruation is based on ancient wisdom of grandmothers. And all these grandmothers they surveyed are upper caste women who had, who had the wherewithal to stay at home, to rest, and so on. So it's a very, very, partial, biased kind of survey. But through that, they aim to convince people that a woman of menstruating age is extremely powerful, and she might fall ill. So if you go into the temple, the deity will fall ill, but you will also fall ill. So one of them is this person called Sinu Joseph. It's in English. It's of course it's a Christian name, but she is one of the vocal supporters of RSS, who runs an NGO called Maitri Menstrual Education, which is full of this kind of pseudoscience. And this is a quote from her blog, an interview that she gave. She's very popular and extremely well supported by the Hindutva elements in power. And this kind of talk was actually supported and spread by many highly educated Hindutva supporting women professionals in the US. In a cardiologist from New York actually even gave a talk on YouTube where she claimed that women's menstruating women would negatively affect the divine energies of the god, and they themselves would face health problems. And obviously many opponents actually questioned her credentials to say that, and because she's a cardiologist and so she practices modern medicine. Anyway, so such things went on. And this again is not something that you would find among the hardcore mainstream of the Hindutva ideology. The concern to project something as science is not a lot. In fact, here in this particular quote, Sinu Joseph is being very critical of RSS leaders who, who call it, it's about celibate deity, etc., etc. These arguments are supposed to be insulting. Now, so the uniqueness of the Ready to Wait campaign was its success in mobilizing sentiment about the crisis of both deity and devotee, and making it look like an attack on a sacred, sentimental, essentially private bond between deity and the devotee. And thirdly, the ready-to-wear campaigns insist on the uniqueness of Hinduism in Kerala. So this led to friction with national Hindutva leadership. So the ideological thrust of the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, which sees temples, as I said before, as platforms on which all Hindus may be mobilized, though not as equals, of course, had welcomed the SC judgment, and there was much resistance to it. So though they had initially welcomed this judgment, they faced resistance, and so they gave in to the view that local sentiment must be respected. So local Hindu practice in Kerala was defended by these women as non-Abrahamic and pagan. So there was this hashtag which the ready-to-wear supporters used called Proud Pagan. And pagan, of course, is understood as victim status, understood as catering to an infinite range of spiritual chase. It's not, but then make it clear, it's not a call for democratizing the faith, neither is this new. It draws on the work of European conservatives like Konrad Elst. All of these are caste deniers and are related to various degrees of anti-Semitic strains of paganism and Orientalism, as evident in the work of Ernest Renan and others. So, but this pagan serves three important purposes. One, it helps to render invisible such intra-Hindu differences, such as those of caste and gender and sexuality. And secondly, it enables defending the ritual as belonging to a regional, more pristine Hinduism that the RSS, with its Abrahamic ambitions, does not understand. And thirdly, it was useful to project the Hindu as a victim of colonization by Semitic religions, which is a good way of hiding its Hindutva aggressiveness. And this defense of so-called diversity, like pointing out that there are many temples which have different kinds of rituals and they can't be compared, etc., etc. The exclusionary practice at Shabarimala is defended, so it's a kind of red herring. And fourthly, much effort is devoted to depicting ritual as knowledge. So I told you about the Maitri menstrual education moment. So, and in short, the ready-to-wear position was no simple reiteration of nationalist Hindutva. It drew on European neo-paganism, setting up local ritualistic Hinduism as a victim of Abrahamic faiths, and much effort was made to insulate it from all critical thinking, to elevate it into a practice that mediated a sacred, pristine, sentimental bond between deity and devotee. So it was, in other words, the perfect foil for online outrage on sentimental terms. Now, if you think about the agency that this kind of positioning enabled, of course, the ready-to-wear right from the beginning has aggressively claimed that to be the space and voice of the true Hindu woman, which they claimed was absent in the debate on faith practices. And this rendered other female supporters of the SC judgment false and unrepresentative of Hindu women. And the defense, and interestingly, the defense of ritual was conducted in the in the language of right, agency, and voice. As this quote. So this is by one of their foremost leaders, Padma Pillai. It says, "If it was man-made and wrong, I'll fight against the tradition. But if it's in the Shastras, then it's my right to fight and obey." Now, the agency, of course, yes, but all said and done, this agency stayed well within the terms set by the historical gendering of agency in the 20th century Kerala. And, the whole idea of changing society through feminine, gentle power of persuasion and tears, that is the discourse. That is so very maternalist, as you can see on this frame. This is about this is a public protest where everybody came out, all the right-wingers came out holding lambs as a form of worship of Ayyappa. This old lady who could not stand up was obviously sitting down, and see the representation of her, that photograph is turned into, so you can see two hands that are bowing below, there's a figure that you can't see who has a bow by his side. His feet are touching her feet and you see that radiant halo around her head. So So that is the figure, that is the supposedly the figure of the deity Ayappa, who is bowing to the mother, who is bowing down. So the god has come down to worship his own deity in this representation. Now, the present is a moment in which this conception of women's agency is being deeply critiqued by feminists and, more importantly, the LGBTQI groups. So when the Hindutva women claim this agency for themselves, uh, it, they were claiming an agency that could be projected as maternalist, feminine, truly feminine, and of course it was a more familiar form of demanding agency. So true female believers as women who willingly put the faith in community sanctioned ritual above choice and freedom, and thus becoming guardians of the faith. So, but then, despite this being maternalist and self-professedly apolitical, it could also be very militant and public. And the outraged mother protesting on the street, so many of them hurled abuses at the Kerala chief minister, called him casteist names. But when contested, they immediately went back to saying, "Oh, please forgive this mother," and so on. Sorry. Oops. Something wrong here. Just a bit, can I just go back and look at the, let me see, something's wrong. Yeah, okay. So, no, actually the PowerPoint is done. I forgot that, sorry. So, there's a shifting of registers between maternalism and very violent public outrage, and very, very, very smooth shifting. Like, for example, aggressive public demonstrations were called Nama Jaba Khoshayatra, which means just prayer processions. And sentimental maternal agency is seen as connecting total strangers, erasing caste differences, and of course, purity of purpose was therefore easy to access, while they compared to the supporters of political parties as impure and demanding payment for services and so on. And devotion was projected as a glue that holds them together. And of course, patience. Now, in this case, this whole business is about being ready to wait till menopause. Now, this is projected as a form of patience and a true feminine virtue. So, in those stories about ready to wait, the women are recounting their devotion, about how they are waiting to go to Shabarimala like a true, like a true woman, who is willing to wait for her beloved or her family. And the fragility of the deity, of course, is constantly emphasized. As you can see in this last slide, he's a son who needs to be protected and so on. Now, it's very evident that the sentimental agency claims of the ready-to-wait campaigners gestures at a notion of citizenship, which again, as Laurent Berland puts it, is not directed towards the public. So no new political space is being opened up. Strict strict segregation of the sexes is being advanced, and aggressive arousal of male sexuality is always feared and in fact accepted as an important aspect. So put simply, the ready-to-wait remains heavily indebted to modern heteropatriarchy of early 20th century Kerala. For all their embrace of neo-paganism, they reacted with Victorian horror at a feminist event celebrating the vagina. Actually, the response from the feminist side was to actually celebrate the vagina and resist its reduction to a reproductive machine. So the ready-to-wait just recoiled at public representations of the vagina, etc. But despite the fact, and this is important, despite the fact of that the ready-to-wait's notion of women's agency was no means revolutionary, it was viewed as a strong assertion by women in the Sangh circles. So in fact, in many of I have in the paper, I have many accounts by men, RSS men, saying that their women for the first time contested them, saying that they were ready to wait, instead of obeying the initial RSS direction to go to Shabarimala. So this was read as a woman's assertion within the RSS, and it was celebrated by the Hindutva leadership on International Women's Day of 2019, saying that women had saved, tradition and culture and so on. And this is again interesting, and this is probably what distinguishes the ready-to-wait women from others. This was accepted by many ready-to-wait women as greatly valuable for their individuation. So many of them wrote saying that this is a landmark event in their own shaping as individuals. And in fact, the language of this writing resembles very closely of a group they wanted to keep away from completely, and that is the feminists. And though the ready-to-wait leadership projected their collective agency as maternalist and sentimental and so on, many of them take pride in representing the woman, so the women's voice, so-called, in the Sangha Parivar, in the Sangh organizations, and then they read it as proof of becoming full members of the Hindutva community. But then, despite all this, they are not feminists, as we all know, as is very evident. They sometimes take that name. There are American authors like Sankrad Sanu, for example, who referred to them as the indigenous feminist movement, which is a complete mistake. And of course, they look like the stereotypical feminists. So, unlike the already active women leaders of the BJP in Kerala, these are well-groomed, English-speaking, modern women who obviously lead lives that are not entirely traditional and so on. They're comfortable with English, they're sophisticated, articulate, mobile. So this fits into a kind of, an image of the feminist. Of course, this doesn't mean that they're feminists. For example, just look at the praise of women's achievers. There's a lot of praise of women's achievers, but none of it is in terms, so never in those accounts is the challenge of patriarchy even mentioned. The patriarchal challenges that these women overcame is hardly mentioned. And instead, it's this language, the idiom is of faith. So these are referred to as Hindu goddesses and so on, like Hindu goddesses, so on. But again, they recognize women's subordination in social reality, but reduce it to either an individual psychological issue or some unfortunate result of cultural decline, rise of materialism, and so on. So the common remedies are self-defense classes, legalization of prostitution. But the interesting point is that all said and done, these women cannot help coming back to the oppression that women face in society. And finally, women's agency, of course, is imagined only within the space of the Hindu community. So Muslim and Dalit women who challenge Hindutva are routinely abused and in extremely casteist, racist terms. But in the end, despite all their pains to distance themselves from the feminists, the ready-to-wait women themselves proved extremely vulnerable to the charge that they were not real women, but elite socialized, which is something that the feminists keep facing. Because as I told you, they disagree with the male leadership of the RSS on temple entry. And for this reason, RSS men on the social media trolled them mercilessly at one point, calling them a whole bunch of names, calling them made-up women who sat in air-conditioned TV studios and yacked away. And interestingly, an important ready-to-wait voice from outside India who has a Christian name, Anjali George, was particularly subject of her name and accused of being a spy and a traitor. So you see, there are things that even when they want to distance themselves from feminism, they cannot. So there have been many other incidents after the mobilization where women who are prominent in ready-to-wait, they have had to come out and complain about patriarchal oppression. So in conclusion, would be that the ready-to-wait campaign success actually represents a shift in Hindutva politics in Kerala. Now you have elite women. Earlier, of course, there were mobilizations of non-elite Hindutva women, like in Marad, in the coastal village of Marad, where there was communal violence in the early years of this century. But now it is the elite women who are leading the show. And obviously, these are women who have benefited hugely from social development in Kerala. And of course, they also have precedents in the 1950s when right-wing women came out in huge numbers to protest against the left-wing government. But then clearly, as I said, the ready debate is not any simple affirmation of nationalist Hindutva or reigning local conservatisms as a politics. It relied upon a notion of citizenship that rested on private acts and built an intimate public around what they call the right to pray. So as a gender politics, they relied solidly on gender common sense of the 20th century, which is of course a hardened conservatism now. And, because in Kerala, we are still, the baggage of the 20th century still hangs heavy on us. So it's very easy to look at this agency and marvel, while there is really no reason to be, because this agency has been thoroughly critiqued by both feminists as well as the LGBTQI community. And of course, this kind of maternalist agency was an important reason why their discourse could be brought into articulation with the gendered vision of the Hindu nation, even when they were regional in their imagination of Hinduism, and had defended it by drawing on a global right-wing imagination. Yet, and as I pointed out, they were equally vulnerable to misogynist attacks, no less, not one bit less than the feminists themselves. And so, in some ways, these are women who are trying to maximize their 20th century feminine capital. It's not just protecting that capital, but actually maximizing it. And I think that this gives us a chance perhaps to strengthen renew our understanding of Brahmanical patriarchy in India in general. That is, maybe we can build on Uma Chakravarti's work further by theorizing more closely and carefully the power relations between upper caste elite women and lower caste working class women. And especially the women who basically make this possible, make sure that it informs our understanding of the politics of the transactions between them, especially in domestic work and domestic labor. So in 19th century reformism, these elite Hindu women were granted the right to study Vedas and perform domestic rituals. So this is actually part of their domestic labor, and we need to take that seriously when we theorize about women in Kerala. So it became a part of the ideal elite woman's domestic labor and her labor of what Hannah Papineau has called family status production. So this has been increasing lately, and it may even mean that the symbolic capital harvested by the elite Hindu woman through the performance of ritual probably rests on the stigmatized paid domestic labor of the lower caste woman. And this is, of course, a hypothesis I'm leaving with you, and thank you very much for listening. I'm stopping here.
Thank you so much, Professor Devika.